Hello and welcome back to Analysis, where we're discussing the long-term impact of the Oslo Accords 20 years after negotiations were first started. Returning from the first half, we have Abe Hayeem, Chair of Architects and Planners for Justice in Palestine. And joining us now in the studio is Usiskin, a writer on Middle Eastern affairs. And joining us by phone, we have Gideon Levy, a columnist for the newspaper Haaretz. In the first part of the discussion, we were hearing from Mustafa Barghouti about the democratic deficit, about the negotiations, in which he was making the point that the PLO are represented, obviously, but that he felt there was an underrepresentation of Gaza, the diaspora, the refugees, and the Palestinians within Israel. How do you see that, Paul?
Well, the whole process, in retrospect, seems to have been biased very much towards Israel's favour, both in terms of the US brokership of it and Israel, and in terms of the fact that Israel held all the cards. So when you start to break it down, the fact that the Palestinians had any kind of representation at all, certainly in the eyes of the Israelis at the time, was pretty good. And there wasn't really an understanding that what the Palestinians saw in terms of their presence at these negotiations was a deficit. They didn't see it that way.
Gideon, do you think that the whole Palestinian community is adequately represented in the negotiations that are going on?
No, it's not. It was not about an entire representation, but the representation was a fair one in the moment that both the Palestinian in the diaspora and the Palestinian under the occupation were represented. I don't think the problems of Oslo, and there are many, and I guess we'll get into them, were about the representation. They were about the substance.
Okay. Abe, do you feel this representation issue has been addressed, or should we stop worrying about that and worry about whatever agreement may or may not come out of the current talks?
Well, I think it's a bit difficult at this stage now to talk about, the whole representation. But I think what we've got to focus now on is international law, making sure that Israel does observe international law, which is, it has up to now looked at it with complete impunity. And the West, the Western governments have actually allowed this impunity. So I think what has got to happen now is for Israel to be put on the spot, to observe international law, to really seriously withdraw from the West Bank. I mean, that has got to be the basis of any settlement, and a real serious withdrawal, not this ridiculous thing of land swaps. And I think that is the basic basis under which, the whole thing should be approached.
Gideon, would the Israeli public accept that as part of an agreement there had to be a withdrawal from the settlements in the West Bank?
Are you talking about 20 years ago, or are you talking
now?
About today?
I'm talking about now.
But now the Israeli public opinion does not exist because the occupation is not on its agenda. Nobody deals with the problem. Nobody deals with the solutions. Israel is busy with other things, total denial, total blindness, and really it's very hard even to start to analyze something that hardly exists. No vision, no plans for the future. Any average Israeli who will be asked, where are your country go to? Well, what are the goals? You will not hear any answer because there are none.
Do Israeli political classes or anyone else feel concerned about the issues of international law, UN resolutions, and all those many legal arguments that have been used often or mostly in very strong criticism of Israel?
Almost totally not. International law applies for the entire world except of Israel. Israel, in the eyes of the Israelis, is a different case. The Jewish people is a different case. And international law does not apply on Israel. And more than this, in many circles, you will hear that international law is basically anti-Semitic because it's chasing only after Israel. So international law is not the issue. The issue really is and should be Are the Israelis aware to what is being done on their behalf, and are they paying the price of the occupation? And unfortunately, the Israelis do not pay the price of the occupation. And as long as they don't pay the price, nothing will change within Israel.
Thanks for that, Gideon. Paul, do you feel that Israeli opinion is going to move on this issue, or is it going to live in a state of ignorant bliss?
I think it's going to continue in ignorant bliss until, as Gideon says, somebody comes along and challenges and makes Israel, or much more to the point, Israelis, recognise that there is a price to be paid. And right now they don't see that there is a price to be paid. As he says, and it's my own experience too, walking into Israel right now and saying, well, what about the occupation? Once upon a time, you used to get people getting very angry with you. Now people shrug their shoulders as if such a thing doesn't really exist. In terms of international law, well, in addition to what we've just heard, there is the other fact that Israel kind of skates along very happily under the coattails of the Americans, who also don't really apply measures of international law unless it suits their national interests. Ask Israelis right now, are they going to be prepared to sign up to a chemical warfare convention like their neighbours across the way in Syria? I heard it on Israel radio this morning, people talking a little bit frantically about it, and again, shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, you know, it could be a problem, but we're not so sure.
I noticed John Kerry's gone very rapidly to Jerusalem to talk to the Israeli government, and one wonders exactly what's been said, since there is now apparently an agreement about removing chemical weapons from Syria. Abe.
Well, I mean, the whole thing is a farce with John Kerry around. I mean, you know, he'll go to speak to Netanyahu not about the peace talks, but about Syria and Iran, and, you know, the whole agenda is, you know, how are they going to get Iran to, you know, dismantle its nuclear weapons or not create nuclear weapons. But the whole issue is there is a price to be paid, and this is where the whole movement for boycotts, divestments and sanction, BDS, is now actually growing right across the world. And there will be a price to be paid, and it's already being felt within Israel. In all the issues, in the firms, international firms that are working in Israel. There's Veolia and G4S. So, and the whole cultural and academic boycott is actually beginning to have an implication.
Perhaps explain what you mean by BDS. I think that would be helpful.
Well, since Western governments have allowed Israel to get away with complete breaking every aspect of the Geneva Conventions and international law, civil society has now decided that action must be taken in whatever area possible. And in, you know, the boycotting of Israeli goods, the boycotting of agricultural produce, which is being, you know, where they're using occupied territories, you know, to export.
Well, the EU has made a decision on that, hasn't it, which is quite an important step forward. Gideon, are the Israeli public, in your view, aware of international public concern of the boycott campaigns and that sort of issue that's coming up all the time?
It starts to penetrate. The last decision of the EU was a very good example that things start to penetrate, but it's really, really just the beginning. Because as we both say, nobody really pays for it until now. So people know that there is something in the air, there is another threat. And as usual, it is immediately translated into the notion that the whole world is against us, whatever we do, and the world is anti-Semitic. And it doesn't matter so much if Israel will change or not, the world will always be against it.
Mm-hmm. Paul, do you think that Israeli opinion is going to wake up on the feelings of people around the world, or will they continue in this sort of belief that somehow or other they can every so often create talks which, as in the case of Oslo, never resulted in final status negotiations, and we're back again to let's sort of where we were, only worse?
Let's take a step back for a moment and ask ourselves where in the current state of Israeli media there is a discussion like this going on. I discovered, as it happens, the morning that the channel phoned me to ask if I'd like to come on, somebody from Israel on Facebook had actually posted that this day, last Friday, was the 20th anniversary of the Oslo Accords. There was nothing about it anywhere else. I read and watch and listen to Israel media all day long. I've heard nothing so far. And when it comes, with respect to Abe, to boycott, disinvestment and sanction, which is what BDS stands for, it's a very pinprick movement outside of Israel. Major companies who are being considered as targets to disinvest from Israel haven't really lined up to that. There may be two or three, a handful. So a German company that was going to be involved in making a cross-occupied territory rail link has pulled out of that. The Dutch government influenced another company to pull out of something else because it was in the West, on the other side of the Green Line. That was over the weekend. But, you know, major companies who invest in Israel, the big companies, the Googles, et cetera, they won't take much notice of BDS. And for what?
They said, oh, they were lager, changed in their views. I mean, these were all the arguments during the apartheid days. Now, not worry about what the Israeli will feel with the opinion they're going to. And in fact,
if you want to get something done for the Palestinians from an Israeli perspective, you have to shift Israeli public opinion. Just go, well, we do this for the Palestinians.
To this point, Israeli opinion must be aware of the economic situation of Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. Do they actually care about it?
They don't care. They are not even aware. And you must understand that this denial was there in worse times than now, and there were worse times under occupation than now. And now, for sure, the media does not report anything about what's going on in the West Bank, and readership has no interest to know about it. And why would they bother? I mean, life is so good in Israel. Why would they bother?
Do you think a serious campaign, enhanced campaign around the world of boycotts and divestments in Israel, as happened in South Africa, whilst it didn't economically necessarily totally damage the country, it did certainly change political opinion because people began to feel very isolated. Is that ever going to happen in the case of Israel, in your view? Gideon?
Yes, I think it will happen when people will really feel it. But right now, you know, if a Dutch company or a German company pulls out, Israelis don't feel it. Israelis travel freely everywhere. Israel is a member in all the sports events, culture events. There are some singers and others, performers, who cancel concerts here, but it's really, until now, quite in a low scale. And don't forget, there is a whole machinery here, a whole system which makes it easier to digest those things. Tells us how anti-Semitic are all those who dare to cancel a concert here. So by and large, Israelis feel very good about themselves, and really there's very little that bothers their confidence.
I noticed in the demonstrations in Israel last year about austerity, unemployment and poverty. And I must say, the last time I was in Tel Aviv, I kind of noticed for almost the first time in any time I've been in Israel, real poverty amongst some people. But this was never, as far as I recall, linked in any way to the occupational treatment of Palestinians.
No,
is this going to change? Abe,
yeah,
then yourself.
They actually tried. This was specifically, they tried to, you know, sort of sideline, you know, the whole Palestinian issue, which was one of the criticisms of the social protests. But what Gideon and Paul have said about, oh, the Israeli public is, you know, totally unaware and not concerned. In fact, polls have showed that it has become very, very right-wing. The degree of racism in the Israeli public is absolutely astounding. The racism and the extreme, almost neo-fascism of Israel's right-wing parliament is just, you know, it's back to the Jim Crow days. So, I mean, here we've got to really sort of decide. In fact, there is actually in effect. Firms, the whole of the Scandinavian countries are cutting out their, removing their trust funds from Israel. There is an impact, and it grows over the years.
What do we call it at this point? This Israeli public opinion and the attitude towards African refugees trying to get into Israel.
First of all, social protest as it took place 2 years ago in Tel Aviv, the young leaders of it made a clear decision not to involve the issue of the occupation and kept away from it on purpose. Now what you have, and I don't totally agree with the complete picture of an Israel that is totally right-wing, I think a percentage, a large percentage, the dominant percentage votes in that way and supports right-wing politics. But I don't think all of Israelis are racists, and I don't think all of them support the notion of how you deal with asylum seekers and new immigrants who are trying to escape hardship in African countries. That being said, the voice is raised about what you do to help asylum seekers, and the voice in the Knesset stopping the behaviour of the Prime Minister when he simply wants to go and do a deal with an African country and just take them all back aren't loud enough. But to say that they're not there, to say that there isn't a voice raised, I think is a little unbalanced.
There's two things I want to try and cover in the last few minutes we've got for this discussion. And firstly, the issue of the effect of the changes in Egypt and the whole experience of the Arab countries for the past 2 years, what effect that's having on isolating Gaza from the West Bank and the rest of the Palestinian community. And then lastly, I want all three of you to give us some ideas of where you think all this is leading to. So, Gideon, what's the feeling about what's happening in Egypt now and the apparent virtual closure of the Rafah crossing by Egypt at the moment?
It's two questions, because what's happening in Egypt is one thing, and what's happening in Gaza is a different thing. As I said before, what happens in Gaza doesn't bother anybody, but really anybody. Egypt is, again, an example for Israelis to be convinced, deeply convinced, that there is no room for any concessions and no room for any political settlements, not to speak about peace. Because look how Arabs are killing Arabs, and that's the way it's been perceived here.
Well, I think the situation has reached such an impasse now that something will have to be done, to actually change the situation. And I think big governments have got to realize, for instance, Britain, billions of arms sales, they have got to start taking action, on Israel. Sanctions, will have to be imposed by the big governments to change the situation, to impose international law. And I think the Palestinians will have to go back to the UN and actually demand actual statehood, because, that is the only option left to them now, because I think the peace talks are a complete farce. So where do we go from now? I think they've got to go back to the United Nations. They've got to use their position, to take Israel to the International Criminal Court, the leaders who have all been involved with war crimes. And that has got to be, sort of challenged as well. And certainly, the boycotts, divestments and sanctions has got to be completely pursued.
The talks are promoting a two-state solution. The UN vote, which gave a form of recognition to Palestine, in a sense recognises a two-state solution. Do you think it's going to happen? Do you think it's viable? Or do you think we're going to go on with a sort of miasma of disagreement for many years?
Well, there's a view that says that when two sides come together and neither comes away after negotiation happy about the deal, then it's a deal that's going to work. At the moment, most incredibly, we have no idea what is the substance of the talks. For the very first time in the history of any talks that we've seen in this area, nobody's telling you what's going on, so it's a bit of a mystery. But there is a but, and the but is that I think there are pinpricks that are beginning to impact on the government of Israel of the day. The first is its reaction to these new arrangements that the EU wanted and wants still to impose on organizations, Israeli organizations, who get EU funding but may have a relationship with the occupation. Look at the crisis mode that the Israeli government, from top to bottom, went into and is still feeling over the matter. Look also at the reaction of the same Israeli government when the Palestinians got closer and closer and closer to some kind of recognition by the United Nations. You'd think, you know, if you are the occupier, the big power in the region, you fear nobody, that these things wouldn't bother you. They really did.
Well, it shows that sanctions do have an impact, in
Wasn't the
fact.
sanctions,
It's part of it.
We've got a few minutes left. I want to we've got exactly 3 minutes left, I'm being told, in my left ear. So it must be true. In those 3 minutes, I'd like to hear from all three of our guests. This is 20 years on from Oslo. Final status negotiations never happened. We've had settlements, we've had migration, we've had refugee crises, we've had caste-led, we've had a whole lot of things since that time. If all four of us were in the studio in 20 years' time, and let's hope we all are, starting with you, Gideon, what do you think will be the situation then? Gideon?
Yes, I missed the question, sorry.
Sorry, I was just saying that if we were all here in 20 years' time, and let's hope we all are, after 20 years after these talks, what do you think we'll be then saying about the situation facing Palestinians in all their forms and Israelis by that time?
We will again and again take this cliche of the Titanic and say, how come that so many people were so blind and so many opportunities were missed? And how did we dare to miss those opportunities? Because some of them will turn to become irreversible. And I think that 20 years from now, Israelis will ask themselves, where have we been?
Abe?
Well, I think this is one of the great moral issues of our time, this whole Palestinian-Israel crisis. And I think what is going to happen is if Israel continues in the way that it's doing and being allowed to do so, the whole sort of situation will just implode on itself. And what I would like to see in 20 years' time is one state where every citizen there has equal rights, human rights are all addressed, and it creates a really thriving, full-fledged democracy, you know, that will be a real sort of model for the Middle East, you know.
20 years' time.
Paul, give us,
in 20 years' time.
35 seconds, give us some hope.
Okay. There will be a page in a history book that says Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu managed to get a deal to end a conflict, not peace, not anything else, but an end of conflict.
So you think it's going to be another 20 years of conflict, of disagreement and non-agreement?
There'll be a frozen deal. The conflict will be ended.
Abe, do you concur with that?
No, I don't think so. I think this is what Israel wanted.
Gideon, in 10 seconds, conflict. What's your word?
I think we have to be realistic enough to believe in miracles.
Thank you very much to all my guests this evening on the Islam Channel. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and let's hope that there is peace and justice in the future for the Palestinian people. Thank you.